I'm now going to go ahead and start the recording for our program so that this will be recorded. I hope that's all right with everybody, but it makes it so that the program can then be up on our website, or links can be made to it and we can share it. We will share it with all of you participants, so that if you'd like to share this program with folks you know or family or friends, you're welcome to do so. And we will put it on our website as well. So my name is Sarah Gladu, and I work with Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust, and I had the pleasure of walking out on our fields, actually right out there, very not so long ago, with Maeve and Laura, our presenters. And so I'm really thrilled they could come and, or not come in quotes, via Zoom and do this program with us. I have a few housekeeping things. I have taken it upon myself to go ahead and mute you all. And so you do, however, have the ability to unmute yourself at any point. So speakers can unmute to speak, and participants, if you have questions and we don't notice, it is a small group. So, you know, feel free to say something at the time if you wish. And I thought it also, after we do a little housekeeping, would be appropriate to go and just find out from each of you what brings you to this presentation and why you're here and who you are and that sort of thing. So I'd like to do a quick housekeeping, and then who you are and why you're here. And I will also introduce our speakers and turn it over to them in fairly short order. So in terms of housekeeping, I have muted you, and you can unmute yourself when you'd like to speak, ask a question or comment. And I am recording. So I think that probably just about does it. Speakers, if you would let the audience know when you start your presentation, you know, if you would rather have the comments and questions held to the end, or if you would rather have them stop you in your tracks, that's really up to you, however you'd like it to be. And that'll work out just fine. So for those of you who know Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust, we are very pleased that we have these amazing grassland areas for birds. And we do have bobolinks and Savannah sparrows and all sorts of other creatures. And so we're in the same boat, maybe some of you are in, is trying to figure out how to manage those fields as best as we can. And there's really quite a lot to think about. I am enjoying this, all of this that I'm learning as well. So Laura is going to be speaking with us, and also Maeve, and I really appreciate it from Ag Allies. And Laura is also with the Somerset County Soil and Water Conservation District, and so she'll be able to they'll talk about the organizational component of this as well, so you understand how it all fits together. But they're great partners, all of them, and so we really appreciate this. And Kelt, who Maeve works for, is also listed, so that's the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust, and it's a good partnership. So let's hear from you folks. What brings you to this specifically? I'm curious what brings you to the program, and I'll have to just call on each of you because there's no other way to probably do this on Zoom. But Mike and Margie, Shannon, would you mind sharing with us? You can just unmute yourself and share with us.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. We are Mike and Margie Shannon. We live at Belfast Co-housing, and we have a field behind our house, and which belongs to co-housing, and another probably 80-acre field adjacent to our property. And we have quite a good number of bobolinks. And sometimes we have bobolinks. We can stand at our living room window and look out and see bobolinks just a few feet away. They come right up in the yard. It's very wonderful. And the farmer who mows the big field, not our land, wait as long as they can before they mow, and hopefully the bobolinks have fledged before they start mowing. So it's a good situation.
Great. That's fun to hear. Thank you. So Faith, would you mind sharing with us?
Hi, can you hear me?
That's great. Yes.
Name is Faith Willard. I live in Bremen, and I'm just really interested in grassland birds.
Super. Thank you. Deborah.
Hi, Debbie Hughes. I'm here with my husband, Bill Wood, and we live in Alna, Maine, and we have a 12-acre parcel, and we have wonderful bobolinks on them. And my husband tries very much to time his 3 times a year mowing in the spring to delay mowing so the bobolinks can continue to thrive. So we're admirers of the birds.
Super. Thank you. And Jane Wallace, please. Oh, you're still, there you are. Do you want me to, here, I'll unmute you, Jane, hang on. Let's see. Do you know how to, you just go down to the bottom of the screen usually and find, she's nodding like she knows what she's doing. There you are.
Oh, can you hear me now?
It's super, yes.
Okay, great. Jane Wallace, and I'm on the Bremen Road in Waldoboro with a 10-acre hayfield that I'm looking out at, which is gorgeous on the Meadowlark River. And same story, Farmer Brown hays our field once or twice a year, and he delays in the early cutting until the birds have fledged. So that's great. Yeah, he's good about it.
Great story. Thank you. Tracy.
Go ahead.
Hi, Tracy is my daughter, and she's taking care of me because I just had a hip replacement. And my partner Roger Acker is here. Anyway, we are right in back of Brown Top ice cream store, and so we abut the conservation land. And we had some bobolinks this year, and we are just curious about how we can help.
Excellent. I'm looking at your house basically from where I'm sitting. Thank you. Amy.
See, hi.
Hi.
Can you see me okay? Okay. So I was telling you, Sarah, I grew up on Bobolink Lane and didn't even know what it was for the first many years of my life. And I've never seen one. So I was excited to see this program to finally learn about them, and yeah, hoping to see one soon.
Excellent. Super. It's great you could come. All right. I think I got everybody. I hope I did. Thank you very much, everyone, for introducing themselves. That's very helpful. I am now going to turn it over to our first speaker, Maeve McGowan from Kelt. And I don't think she needs much of a introduction. You probably read her bio even in the advertisement for the program. But thanks for joining us and for leading us in this. Maeve, go ahead.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Sarah. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So yeah, thanks so much for coming. Just a little bit of overview of what Laura and I are going to cover tonight. So we'll talk a little bit about our background and why we're here talking to you about these birds. I'm going to go over some terminology that we use when talking about these birds, so try to strip away some of that sciencey jargon. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on each species that we're going to focus on. So primarily bobolinks and Savannah sparrows, but we'll also talk a little bit about eastern meadowlarks. We'll talk about the breeding season. We'll talk about population trends for both species. And then we'll also talk about broader outlooks and threats challenging the species. And then Laura in particular will really dive into bird-friendly land use and management and how Ag Allies can help you. So Laura, I don't know if you want to just jump in and introduce yourself real quick.
Yes, that would be great. Thanks, Maeve and Sarah. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm really particularly excited by all of your great stories and reasons. And we've got a good group of folks here, I think, and it really helps to get a feel for who's out there. I started with this project back in 2016. I've been a longtime volunteer for Avian Haven Wild Bird Rehabilitation Center, so had started learning about grassland birds, and we have grassland birds on the fields that we now own. And I got launched in this project because we happened to take a look at the property the day that they mowed the field in early July, and there were a bunch of parents looking for their babies in the hay. So I realized that this was happening everywhere, and hence we started this outreach program. And you'll probably hear more about him from Maeve, since Maeve did a lot of research with him. I have been fortunate to be able to do training with Dr. Noah Perlett, who's been doing research in the Champlain Valley area of Vermont for over 20 years. So that's given me some good background. I also worked with Tom Gavin at Cornell University for some field work as well. So that's the bit about me, and I will turn it back over to Maeve.
Thanks, Laura. So I went to the University of New England in Biddeford, and when I was there, I was lucky enough to conduct some research on these remarkable birds. So in this picture, I'm holding a male bobolink that I had just caught in that mist net. So I did a field season in 2018 at Shelburne Farms in Shelburne, Vermont. And then I spent the following 3 years analyzing the data that I had collected, and then also the previous 20 years of data, really focusing on climate change and trying to figure out how these birds are responding to climate change, if at all. That research was just recently published in the Journal of Ecology and Evolution this past spring. And then I also bring a background of land conservation to the table. So I've been lucky enough to work at the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust for 7 years now, many of which were spent as an intern. So I've been here since I was about 16. And I'm kind of taking my two passions of land conservation and bird protection together to help private landowners, but also land trusts learn how to protect these birds. And Laura, if it's okay with you, I'm totally okay with people asking questions as we go. I would love for it to be as conversational as possible. So please feel free at any point to just unmute yourself or raise your hand, and we'll try to address your questions. So a little bit of terminology that I'm going to be using as we talk about these birds. A distinction that is frequently made with migratory birds is whether they're a short distance migrant or a long distance migrant. And that classification is based on where they winter relative to this line, which is the Tropic of Cancer. So if a bird winters north of the Tropic of Cancer, they are considered a short distance migrant. And if they winter south of the Tropic of Cancer, they are considered a long distance migrant. And that distinction is going to become important as we're comparing our different study species. Another term that I use quite frequently is clutch and brood. So a clutch is just a set of eggs, and then a brood is the same thing, but once the babies have actually hatched. To fledge means basically when a bird is able to fly. So there's a period of time after the babies have hatched and actually left the nest that they can't quite fly. So fledging is, when they leave the nest, but also when they're successfully able to escape farm machinery. And then when I say flush, that just means when you spook a bird off of its nest. So mom and dad both help incubate, particularly for bobolinks. And you'll if you ever scare a bird and it sounds very rushed and you can hear its wings very loudly and it's not doing a good job being quiet, you probably just flushed it off of its nest. So our first study species is the bobolink. This on the left-hand side is a male, and the one on the right is either a female or a male not in its summer plumage. So outside of the breeding season, all of them actually have that yellow plumage that the females have. They're in the blackbird family. If you've never seen one, they're a little bit smaller than a robin. The males in particular are really distinguished by their plumage. So we refer to their plumage as like a backwards tuxedo. So they have these pretty incredible white and black markings along their back. And then they also have that bright yellow cap during the breeding season. They are also distinguishable by their call, which sounds pretty similar to R2-D2 from Star Wars. So it's very easy to usually recognize them by sound before you can actually see them because they sound so bubbly and charismatic. Bobolinks are in fact long distance migrants. So they summer up here in Maine, in Vermont, and New Hampshire, up in Canada as well. But they winter in South America, primarily in Venezuela, and then to Bolivia and Argentina. So this is actually a graphic of their migration. So they typically, after they leave their breeding site in New England and Canada, many of them fly straight to Venezuela, and they stay there for a little bit to fatten up, typically on rice, and then they continue their migration down to Bolivia and Argentina. We found recently that there's actually a couple portions of breeding populations that have been stopping over in Galapagos and the other islands nearby, which is pretty cool, because for many years we thought that they did a straight flight there, which is still thought to be the case for a lot of these birds. And we're able to collect that data by actually deploying geolocators on them. So some of those geolocators, we're having to recapture the birds to collect the data of where they've flown. And some of them are actually live feedback. So we can watch a map and actually watch the birds as they migrate, which is pretty incredible. One of our other focused species is the Savannah Sparrow. Savannah sparrows are short distance migrants. So they summer here, but they winter down south in terms of South Carolina, North Carolina, summer in Florida. Something that's quite, and this is an image of their migration. Something that's quite interesting about these birds is some studies have found that the males and the females actually winter separately. So they take a couple months break from each other, and we don't really know why, but we kind of all understand why. But I always find that to be quite an interesting fact about Savannah sparrows. And then this is the eastern meadowlark. So like both our bobolinks and our Savannah sparrows, they are also ground laying. Relative to both of those other species, these are in the steepest decline. Certainly they're all species of concern, but the meadowlarks, due to their habitat needs and other factors, are in quite grave danger. I just think they're incredible birds. I always point out to folks their talons right here, they're quite impressive. But yeah, they're certainly facing threats on many fronts, just like our bobolinks and our savannas. And this is what their migration looks like. So just to dive in a little bit about their reproductive cycle. So both bobolinks and Savannah sparrows are ground laying. So they're laying their nests directly on the ground. They're not, elevating it like blackbirds or other birds that weave them around grass. It's directly on the ground. Some of them have hay that actually covers it. They create little domes over their nests to hide their eggs. Others are open cups like this one right here. This is an image of a bobolink nest. And what I tried to capture in this image is how it's in really dense grass, to emphasize that that's what these birds are looking for, but also just how small it is and how well it blends in. And that if you were just walking through a field, you would probably have no idea that this is there. Both species are also what we call sit and wait birds. And what that means is that if mom or dad is on the nest, either incubating or keeping the babies warm once they've already hatched, or feeding the babies, they're not going to fly off of that nest until something is right above them, whether that's a predator or farm machinery or somebody walking. And my point with this is that, I never go into a field during breeding season, but if I am going into a field, I'm always carrying these, what I call flushing sticks, in front of me to move the grass before I walk through it, to make sure I don't step on a bird. Another point with that is that even though the adult birds can fly and might be able to escape the machinery, haying when they're actively breeding is dangerous for all of the birds, the babies and the adults. Between the two species, they have an average clutch size of between 2 to 7 eggs. I would say for the most part, we're seeing Savannah sparrows between 5 and 6 eggs, and bobolinks around the same. Savannah sparrows in particular, they might have more than one nest in a summer. For bobolinks, it's a little bit more challenging because they do have such a long migration to make. That makes their breeding window a little bit narrower. But Savannah sparrows arrive in Maine and their other breeding grounds earlier than the bobolinks do. And because they have a shorter migration, they have time to have more than one nest. With bobolinks, if they might try to have a second nest if their first nest fails very early on. But if we're already, halfway through the breeding season, they just don't have the time to do it. And then for both species, we're looking at a breeding cycle between May and August for the most part. We will see the adults arrive a few weeks before they're actually actively breeding. And then we'll also see them flock around their fields for quite a while before they actually start migration. So even if the birds are here, that doesn't mean that they're actively breeding. And that's one of the ways that Ag Allies tries to support farmers and landowners, is by helping them understand that difference of the birds are here, but they're not necessarily breeding, so it's safe to hay, or we can tell that they're still breeding, so we're not quite ready for that yet. And then 65 days is one of the important numbers for us to keep in mind. So in terms of their actual breeding cycle, from when mom lays the eggs and builds the nest and is incubating to when the babies are able to fly to escape farm machinery, that takes 42 days. And then it takes an additional 23 days for fields to grow back to the extent where a bird would be able to nest in it. So when farmers are doing more than one cut in a summer, we suggest that they leave at least 65 days between those two cuts, which provides both bobolinks and Savannah sparrows the time they need for the hay to grow back to a point where it's good protection from predators, and for them to actually complete the breeding cycle. And then just to dive a little bit more into what this breeding cycle looks like, because there are many steps. So first is nest building, followed by laying. When mom starts to lay eggs, she lays one a day. Incubation takes between 12 days to 15 days. And then after incubation, the babies start to hatch. They typically all hatch within the same 24 to 36 hours. And then there's fledglings, so babies that have left the nest, but they're not necessarily flying yet. And then they're able to fly. So this image on the right is one of my all-time favorite images of a baby Savannah sparrow. So this was a baby. I was banding a nest, and I looked down and saw bird poop, and looked right to the right of it and saw a little bird just sitting there and looking up at me. And my point is that this baby is old enough to be out of the nest, but can't yet fly. So it's just wandering around the field, just walking. And mom and dad know where these babies are, but there is no way for us to be able to keep track of this. The baby's plumage blends in almost perfectly. You know, if I hadn't have seen the bird poop, I would have no idea that this baby was there. And it just sat there, just staring at me. So my point is with this is that, you know, even if they're out of the nest, that doesn't mean that they're safe from, you know, people walking through fields or from farm machinery or from dogs. So this is just a picture of a nest that hasn't quite hatched. And then this is a nest on the first day that it has hatched. So this probably is my all-time favorite bird picture. You can see just how tiny the babies are. Their eyes aren't even open yet. The only feathers they have are a little bit of them up on their head and then some on their wings, but it's really just down. They are extremely vulnerable at this point. And the reason that they're sitting there with their mouths open is because they think I'm mom, because their eyes aren't open yet. And they hear something and they're like, must be food. This is also a day one baby. So this is just to give people an idea of how small they are. That's in the palm of my hand. And it's not much larger than a gummy bear. They are teeny tiny. And then this is about just maybe 10 days later, maybe a little bit less than that. So this is the age that the babies are when I was doing research that we were actually banding them. This baby is still pretty small. As you can tell, it's starting to get its flight feathers in, but they still have the pins. So by no means is this baby ready to fly. Still entirely dependent on mom and dad feeding it. And at this point hasn't even left the nest. And then this is a baby that's actually able to fly. So I caught this baby in a nest, in a mist net. And you can tell when it's a fledgling starting to fly relative to an adult, because they're terrible at flying. So you will see through the field, these birds fly up and then crash, and then fly up and crash. And it's quite humorous to watch, but also they're just learning. So they're flying quite low. We would like to think at this point that they could escape farm machinery, but certainly they are not strong flyers yet. So at this point, they're going to hang out on the field for a little bit longer before they actually start migration. And between this first image all the way on the left and this image over here, that's about 24 to 30 days. So the baby has, you know, grown a tremendous amount, spent a period of time when they're still very dependent on mom and dad feeding it, gotten to the point where they're no longer in the nest, but still can't fly, and then finally able to fly. So it's just incredible how much can happen for these birds in such a small window of time. Laura is definitely going to talk a little bit more about this, but just giving you guys a basic idea of what makes for good grassland bird habitat. So certainly habitat that's undisturbed during the breeding season. So that's especially mid-May through mid-July. If you can give them a little bit more flexibility, that's awesome. Certainly more than 8 acres is ideal. Meadowlarks have higher needs in terms of habitat, which is one of the reasons that they're declining more rapidly. So they need more like 15. A point that I definitely want to make that's emphasized by this image is we used to think the size of an individual field was the defining factor of whether or not it would support grassland birds. And while size is certainly important, the more important thing is there being a patchwork of fields. So even if you have a field that's only an acre, I've even seen birds on fields smaller than that. If you have other grassland that's surrounding that field and it provides almost this mosaic of grassland, that's just as good as you having, a large field. Of course, it's ideal, for there to be a larger field with no fragmentation, but we can accomplish the same support of these species by having this patchwork. For both species, it's ideal for it to be a mix of grasses and forbs. Dense grass is best. Typically, these birds are looking for the same thing that our farmers are looking for. So they're looking for nutrient-rich and healthy grass that's going to provide dense cover and protection from predation. And then they also don't like woody or shrubby plants. So when we start to see our woody stemmed plants move in, that's not ideal. So something that Laura and I also frequently navigate with folks is how do we maintain space for our pollinators that are supported by some of those woody plants while also maintaining space for our grassland birds. And then also, again, because of that density, fields that are healthy in terms of their soil, so they're maintained with lime and fertilizer as needed, and of course, timing our cut around the presence of these birds. And then it's certainly ideal for them to have larger fields with less edge as possible. Both species, particularly bobolinks, will avoid nesting by edges because edges and tree line is where predators hide. So you're more likely to see a bird nesting in the center of a field because they're safer there. And then certainly it's important to make sure that these fields are cut every year to maintain the habitat. As soon as that woody and shrubby stuff starts to grow in, that's really going to displace our grassland birds. Similarly, when we talk about them avoiding edges, they also avoid paths. So these birds in many ways see a path that's cut through a field just like a tree line. So they're going to avoid those as well, particularly if they're frequented by people. And then also having a water source nearby is a really great attraction for these birds. Certainly, even though a large field is ideal, I do really want to emphasize that the patchwork is what's most important. So when people have fields that are much smaller than that, by all means, they can support these birds effectively. Just to talk a little bit more broadly about the population trends for grassland birds. So many of our birds are in trouble. But a study in 2019 found that of all groups, grassland birds more broadly are in the most danger. So you can see down here on the bottom of the graphic, this is the proportional decline of the species. So since 1970, that's been a net loss of more than 700 million breeding individuals. And I want to emphasize that's a net loss. So every year, we lose some and we gain some, but this is, at the end of the day, the difference between those two. So we're seeing a net loss of that many, which is a 53% proportional loss across the group of grassland birds. 74% of species that are classified as grassland are declining. And in the state of Maine, a bobolink is classified as a species of greatest conservation need tier 3. There's 3 tiers in Maine. So tier 3 is of least concern and tier 1 is of utmost concern. But the fact that they even make that classification speaks to their decline. And then nationally, bobolinks have declined by 65% between 1966 and 2015. For Savannah sparrows, it's about 49%. They do not make that classification level in Maine. So why is it that these birds are declining so much more rapidly than other birds? So the first of which is certainly habitat loss. This, I think, is the #1 reason for declines in every species across the board. But when we think about the habitat that supports these species, in Maine, this habitat is, completely artificially made. We didn't have grassland before our farmers. If we let grassland just grow back, it would be forest eventually. So part of it is grassland that's growing back to forest. Part of it is that grasslands are pretty easy to develop and to build upon. And they're also pretty easy to fragment in terms of, making it smaller, shrinking it, increasing edges, etc. At the same time, or on a similar note, intensified agriculture is a big threat facing them. So even though these birds depend on agriculture to create their habitat because it wouldn't exist without those farmers, if we intensify the agriculture so that we're cutting more regularly and we're using this different equipment that now makes it impossible for them to survive a cutting, that's really going to displace and challenge a lot of these birds. This is kind of a bigger one to digest, so I have a slide just on this one. Climate change presents so many threats to these birds in every area. So, with warmer and drier summers, we're seeing a disruption of their food sources. So there might be, fewer insects, or the insects might be available at a different time when the birds aren't as dependent on them. We're seeing a disruption in their actual migration. Because we're having warmer and drier weather, we're also seeing more invasive species. And when it comes to species like smoothbed straw, that's going to displace these birds. Also, because of warmer and drier summers, our grass is ready earlier for our farmers to cut. And the birds have not yet started advancing their migration. So the farmers are cutting earlier and earlier, but the birds are arriving at the same time. And because of that, there's a greater conflict in the breeding season with cutting. And then collectively, all of these things can contribute to that population decline. So this is from the research that I did in Vermont, and this just illustrates how haying is changing in a changing climate. So we saw over the course of just 20 years, we saw a first hay date advance by about 10 to 15 days. And when you think of that in the context of the 65-day window that these birds need, that's quite significant. 10 to 15 days can make the difference of not only babies being able to fly, but babies being able to even leave the nest. So when 10 to 15 days doesn't sound like much, particularly over 20 years. But when we think about A, how the climate is changing more and more rapidly, and B, what that means in the context of 65 days, it's quite significant. Other threats facing these birds, particularly for bobolinks in their wintering habitat, is pesticide and herbicide use. So the Latin name for a bobolink, which is Dolichonyx orzivorius, comes from the name rice bird. And in South America, they're actually referred to as the devil of the rice. And that's because down there where they winter, they really focus on feasting at rice plantations and fattening up on that food source just because it is so abundant in fat and protein. And because of that, they're poisoned by the farmers, and they're also hunted and trapped and then sold as pets. Certainly also the use of pesticides and herbicides here presents a major threat to these birds. And then disruption by humans and domestic animals. So, certainly walking through a field during breeding season, you might have no idea if you step on a nest because they are so small. And then similarly, with dogs in particular, dogs and cats, but particularly dogs, if they're running through a field, it could be, the best behaved dog in the world. But if that dog either A, steps on a nest, that can completely destroy it, but also if either we or our animals spread our scent near these nests, that's going to attract a predator to that nest. A little bit more about these threats. So if a bird is nesting on a field and the field is mowed before the nest has completed its full breeding cycle, there is a 99% chance it's going to fail. So because of the farm machinery we use nowadays, it is highly unlikely that that nest will survive. And then also, again, the presence of invasive species greatly diminishes the habitat quality. When we think about how these birds want the densest grass possible to serve as protection from predators, as soon as invasive species move in and disrupt that grass, that's really going to displace these birds. And then other common forms of human disruption. So again, stepping on nests, which can crush the babies or the eggs. If you were walking through a field before a nest is even hatched and you scare a female too early, she might not be willing to go back to her babies because she considers the human presence a threat. And then again, domesticated animals, either disrupting the birds, eating them, or attracting predators to their nest. And again, Laura's going to talk more about this, but how you can help these birds because they are facing threats on all these fronts. So first and foremost, making sure that if you own grassland bird habitat, making it the best quality habitat as possible. So improving the soil quality, which then in change improves the field quality. So these two images are just supposed to illustrate what these birds are looking for in terms of habitat quality, which again is exactly what our farmers are looking for. So on the left-hand side, this is a field probably early June. So pretty early in the breeding season, but you can still see that that grass is quite dense. And on the right-hand side, this is later in the breeding season. So this is probably mid-July. And at this point, this grass was going up, above my hips. It was very, very tall at that point. So both of these images show just what great coverage that these birds are looking for. And if we can accomplish, good hay for our birds, we're often also accomplishing good hay for our farmers. Another probably more crucial component of this is strategically timing our haying and our other management. So if you do have fields that you're cutting, whether you're cutting for livestock or you're cutting for other reasons, making sure to time that hay so that we're not disrupting these birds. An important point about this that Laura will definitely dive into is this field management doesn't look the same for everybody, because some people are feeding dairy cattle, because some of them are feeding beef cattle, some of them are feeding horses. People and farmers in particular have different needs in terms of when their fields need to be cut. And there's different ways that Ag Allies can work with you around this. So we typically say our safe date for these birds is around July 15th. But we work with farmers to try to provide as much flexibility as possible because we know that for many people, this is their livelihood. So this is an example of finding kind of an alternative method to make this work. So Laura, feel free to hop in at any point. But this was a farmer who needed to cut. So what Laura did is she went out and she identified where most of the bird activity was and actually created this blockade with the farmer that he waited to let those birds fledge. And what's pretty incredible is this is that same block and you can see the adult bobolink sitting right on the edge guarding it because their babies are in fact in there. So even though he was able to cut a large portion of his field, just maintaining the center block where all of the bird activity was it probably made the difference for these birds to have a successful breeding season. And then this is with our friends at Great Salt Bay Farms from Coastal Rivers. And this is just an image of people out there looking for these birds. But our work with Coastal Rivers has been quite incredible in terms of, partnership and finding new ways to address invasive species while also maintaining habitat for these birds. And it can be challenging at times to balance those two things, but when partners are willing, it makes it all happen. So kudos, Sarah, we appreciate it. And then another really important factor is just educating yourself, which you've all done by being here today, and educating your neighbors and your friends. So this is from a presentation that Laura and I gave back this summer at Georges River Land Trust. It was just a friendly walk and talk where we looked for birds and then we answered questions casually. And I hope that at some point we'll be able to do one of these with Coastal Rivers. But it's really, really fun and rewarding to get in the field with people and talk about how amazing these birds are. And it feels like so often it's just people needing to know that those birds are there in order to protect them. So, a lot of people I think have never even heard about a grassland bird and think, why would a bird nest on the ground? That's the silliest place to nest ever, which I totally understand where you're coming from. I thought the same thing when I heard about them. So just having that conversation, whether it's with your neighbor or with a friend or with your farmer, and having a conversation about, do you have grassland birds and what are you doing to protect them? It can make a really big difference just one person at a time. And then another way you can help either as an organization for our land trust friends or as a private landowner is adjusting your land uses. And that is pretty broad in terms of adjusting when you're cutting your hay. If you're addressing invasive species, making sure you're doing that when the birds aren't actively breeding. If you have paths, trying to keep them to the side as opposed to cutting through the middle. And if you have dogs, keeping them on leash so that they're not disrupting these birds. It's great if you can make these changes more permanently, but even if you can just do it during the breeding season, that can make a really big difference. So even if you're just doing it from, late May to mid, to mid or late July, for these birds, that can make all the difference. And then Laura, I have a few more slides, but I think I'm actually just going to exit out since your slideshow is all about how Ag Allies can help these folks. So I'm going to switch over, and Laura is actually going to bring up her presentation. While Laura does that, does anyone have any questions so far just about life history about these birds or breeding cycle or anything like that? Great.
Okay, can everybody hear me and see my slides? Yes. Maeve, that was a great introduction and overview of a lot of really complicated stuff, but really interesting stuff. The birds are really facing lots of different threats coming at them from lots of different directions. And so Ag Allies is here to try to work with land managers to help increase the nesting success of grassland birds. And as I mentioned, we started the program back in 2016. I work for Somerset County Soil and Water Conservation District. That's sort of my other hat. I work with farmers doing nutrient management planning and that sort of thing. And basically, after I told you about my epiphany in our grassland bird field, I went to our board and said, I would love to start this project and program and see if we can start working with some farmers. It was fantastic that I already knew a lot of farmers because of my other work. And so in 2016, we got a small grant and started working on this. So we do this, we do what we do through the use of incentive payments where they're needed and using technical assistance and outreach and education. And one of the great things about this year is that we were able to get some funding to work with Maeve in particular. She has become sort of Ag Allies South, which is great. So we're both out there doing these things on the ground for folks. So the process, if somebody's interested in trying to make some room for grassland birds, it's pretty informal. We interested landowners, they will get in contact with us. And then usually the first thing we do is set up a site visit to go out and assess the habitat that they have and see where the birds are, and also discuss the farm's management needs and goals to see if we can figure out how we can implement some practices that will work in each individual situation. And then, as I mentioned, we'll utilize incentive payments as needed to help offset the costs of some of these management changes. So again, the first thing we're doing when we're going out to a farm, Maeve mentioned not one size fits all. We're looking at the whole farm plan. We're starting right from the beginning, finding out what they have for critters, what kind of hay they're needing, and all of those sorts of things to figure out how we can make some room for grassland birds. This is Pumpkin Vine Valley Family Farm in Somerville, and they just started working with us this year. They have a goat dairy, so they are my first our first goat dairy folks that we've had, but we'll be doing some delayed mowing with them next season. So again, we're looking for best fit practices for habitat conservation depending on the management regime that's on the field. And we work either directly with the farmers. Sometimes we work with land trusts and then end up working with the farmers that they're working with. Sometimes we work with the landowners, and then we sort of come into the farmers from the back end of that. So we pick up in any spot that folks are interested in having us be there. David Krebs here is one of our organic dairy farm producers. He's one of our rock stars of the program. He started early on, and we do both a grazing block for him that on a 50-acre field, and also he leaves another hayfield for the birds every year. So since 2016, so he's awesome. So again, one of the practices we use, as Maeve mentioned, is just delay mowing from the start of the season until July 15th on the entire field. And that's the easiest way. It gives all the birds there their best chance of doing their thing. This year we were really psyched to have, we had 2 Harrier nests that were also in these fields that we had protected. So that's been fun. So that's one of the options. And then Maeve showed you this block is another option for folks if they can't leave the whole field. Sometimes we can find, just kind of take, usually, as Maeve again said, it's the center of the field. So we can help folks stake out blocks, and we've done more and more of that the last couple of years, as folks can't maybe necessarily give up the whole field, but and we've had some really great success with these blocks. There's also Noah Perlett has done some research on doing an early cut in early May that a lot of people are interested in. So far, we haven't had too many folks do this because of Maine's weather can be who knows what in May, and there might not be enough forage that early to cut, or it might be too wet to get it, which certainly wasn't the issue this year. But this is a strategy that is something we're happy to do it, to experiment with if folks are looking, if this kind of fits with what they want to be doing. And then we've worked with a lot of folks with grazing. Again, I mentioned Pumpkin Vine Valley. They will be doing, all of their land is that on the farm is mostly for grazing. So we're going to be looking at leaving some fallow paddocks. And that's just exactly what we did with Lonza Rockland. Lonza is a business down in Rockland, and when they called and told me they had grassland birds, I thought, in the middle of Rockland, I don't think so. But I went out, and they have this incredible 40-acre field behind their business, and they said, well, we have a farmer who comes and grazes the field. So we worked with Lonza, and we worked with the farmer, and were able to set up paddocks that went out around the outside of the field. Again, Maeve mentioned, the birds are going to be nesting in the center. So he moved his sheep kind of around the outside edges. And then by the time he was through with that, the birds were pretty much, up and flying. So then he was able to move them into the center. So that worked out really well. So again, Great Salt Bay, the Coastal River Conservation Trust has recently made changes in their leases and policies that make room for grassland birds. And we're also working with them on some field refurbishment. And these sorts of things are long-term changes which will improve the nesting success of our birds. So we love working with land trusts. Specifically, Coastal Rivers has been great in terms of wanting to do the best that they can to add that management piece in for the birds. So we're also looking at, additional ways to integrate nesting habitat. We work with farmers and landowners. There might be, again, this is often true of when we're working with dairy farmers and sometimes beef farmers, that we're helping them find their most productive fields where they can more intensively manage them. And then we'll have the room to leave some of the sort of secondary lands for the grassland birds. We're also always looking for folks who have lands that aren't necessarily being produced for forage, that are sort of non-competitive grasslands for birds, which is a great way to, you can leave the field as long as the birds need, and there isn't any pressure to get the hay off. So, and we also work with farmers to help them to match their late cut hay with critters that need late cut hay. Livestock can be divided into a couple different categories, and so some of our critters need the high protein, high digestible carbohydrate hay, which is the early cut stuff. So those fields, it's difficult to do grassland bird management on. But if we're working with folks that have some critters from category 2, oftentimes that delayed cutting can really match well with what the nutritional needs are. And even with our dairy cows, quite often we'll have a farmer who leaves one field maybe late to add some high fiber into their rations. So again, there's usually ways that we can work it out if we just, if we have a willing landowner or farmer who wants to do it. So this year's successes, we delayed on over 780 acres this year across the state, from down in Maeve's territory up through mine. And in addition to bobolinks and Savannah sparrows, as I mentioned, we had 2 Harrier nests, and we also had 2 Meadowlark nests and 1 bittern nest, which was exciting, especially since I almost stepped on the mother bittern because I didn't know she was there, and she took off right from under my feet and almost scared me to death. But so we've really been expanding over the last few years. And so one of the, we offer lots of different resources for land trusts and landowners. Again, those site visits, just contact us, and we're starting now our spring list for folks that we're going to go out and see. And as Maeve also mentioned, we will do field checks for farmers who want to get on those fields as soon as the birds are flying. We start checking the fields usually right about the beginning of July. So I think Maeve and I cleared some fields as early as I think the 6th or 7th of July this year, and then probably into July 15th or something around that neighborhood. So, and as we're doing now, we're also happy to provide presentations and other educational outreach. We have our fantastic habitat signs, and we also have informational fact sheets and that sort of thing that we can provide. And down here in the corner is, which Maeve is now familiar with, we both have our soil auger and can help if you're interested in finding ways to improve your fields. So we can help you get your soil test in, and from that we can figure out, what your fields need to improve them. So those are all resources we offer. We're expanding our partnerships all the time. We do have a formal partnership now with the Cornell Land Trust Bird Initiative, and then we've been working with Maine Inland Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So these partnerships really help strengthen our program. So as we all know, farmers face a lot of challenges working with the land. And if we as a society value the wildlife that they're helping to protect, then we need to help them find a balance. And that's what Ag Allies is here trying to help do. And I think that's also true of Coastal Rivers Land Trust. We're all integral players in that balance. So we can make a difference. And then just in case anybody hasn't heard them, we have to end the program with, this is the sound of our bobolinks. So with that, we will take any questions that you may have, and thank you so much for having us here.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute you all, so feel free to jump in.
I have a quick question. I don't live in Maine, and we come in the summer. Is there an interval between the time that the birds have finished the breeding and the fledglings are ready to move on, but they still hang around before they start the migration? Or how compressed is that time between the end of the breeding period and when they start actually moving south?
Go ahead, Maeve, you can.
So the birds do hang out for a little bit before they actually leave. And I would say it changes a little bit based on breeding population, just in that some start their migration earlier than others. And we don't really know what determines why that, when they're moving, when they are. But I will say, sometimes it can be as long as 2 to 3 weeks of these adults and their babies hanging out in the field. The babies are maybe still getting the hang of flying. They're socializing. You'll see the males start to shed their summer plumage. And yeah, they'll flock sometimes for 2 to 3 weeks before they actually start migration. So there's, towards the end of the breeding season, it can be incredibly confusing when you walk into a field and it looks like there's 30 adults because they all have the same plumage and they're just hanging out there, all yelling at you. No one is, portraying breeding behavior. So it can definitely be confusing, which is certainly, something that Laura and I do is when we do those site visits to clear fields, we're determining our clearing on what the adults are actually doing. So are mom and dad carrying food? Because if you see an adult carrying food, they're always feeding a baby. When they're feeding themselves, they eat as soon as they catch it. So if you see mom and dad carrying food, they're definitely feeding someone. And then also what's their agitation when we're around them? So how big does their territory seem? Does it seem like they have a nest? Does it seem like they have babies wandering around in the field? And looking at those different breeding characteristics and behaviors, that's how we determine, are they just flocking and waiting until they migrate, or do they actually still have babies? So yes, they hang out sometimes for as much as 2 or 3 weeks before they actually start their migration.
That's very helpful because this past summer we found a good number at the Great Salt Bay on toward the end of July when we were there, and I assumed that they would be leaving soon, but they had basically completed the breeding process.
Right, that's probably spot on. Occasionally, if a bobolink nest fails early on, we might see some late nesters, but typically they're all wrapped up by mid to late July.
And as you recall, Sarah and Maeve and I actually went out and cleared Great Salt Bay Farm. So we know by that time there was nobody still doing their breeding thing. So we got a chance to see them up close and personal.
Yeah, that was a wonderful experience for me to get the hands-on part. It is hard to identify sometimes exactly what's going on until you're familiar with their behaviors. So yeah, it's great.
Thank you very much for the program.
Yeah, thank you for joining.
Yeah, glad you could join us here.
I'd like to ask a question about a field itself. We have a field right behind our house and it's on a slope. And it hasn't been mowed in at least 3 years. We've got milkweed, goldenrod, things of that sort. The bobolinks seem to be nesting there, but should we mow it? We occasionally get some buckthorn and stuff like that, and we go in the winter and just hand cut it out. But should we be mowing that once a year or once every other year to get more grass, or is the milkweed and goldenrod sufficient? Plus whatever, there's all kinds of stuff in there.
It
Go
probably
ahead, Laura.
It probably would be good to mow that at least every other year to keep that woody vegetation back, because even though they're still there, as that keeps advancing, if it hasn't been mowed, you're going to start pushing their habitat out, and you will start losing your birds.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I always hate, I hate to say mow the goldenrod and the asters, because it really does have a lot of benefit for pollinators, but quite often we can kind of leave stuff like that around the edges. But definitely you want to be cutting that field at least every other year, I would say, because that will keep the grass competitive, which is something that and the clover and that sort of thing, which is really what the grassland birds are looking for.
Right. Okay. It's probably only maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 acres right behind the houses that we haven't gotten mowed. Most of the rest is on a 2 and 3 year rotation of mowing. and a little bit of it is cropland. We have a CSA, but okay, we'll try and the tractor can bog down if we're not careful.
Yeah.
I also wanted to let you know that we have usually a pair of marsh hawks that Harriers, yeah, that we see down in the field, and I don't know if they're breeding or not, but they show up and they fly around the field, they fly over the houses. They're pretty dramatic. And
Oh, they're incredible. Are they
Oh.
around for most of the spring and early summer?
they're around quite a lot, and sometimes, you know, you look out the window and you see one, and next thing you know, your phone's ringing because the neighbors who can see down in the field are, you know, they're going, hey, look out your window, look out your window, look what's down there.
Yeah, they're super impressive. Just the way they soar over the fields.
Sounds like you have good neighbors too.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, well, we have 36 little houses at co-housing, so yeah, there's a lot of neighbors. And another really neat thing is that last January we had a meadowlark show up in our yard, and it was here, and then it was gone, and then it would come back. It was around for at least a month and a half in the middle of winter.
It would stay around the edges of the house, you know, where the snow would melt away and there was vegetation. And that's where we would often see it, right along the bottom edges of the houses where the snow had been away.
Our neighbor got a fantastic picture of this bird. She was inside her living room and took a picture out the window.
Wow.
It was like 2 feet from the window.
Do you know Seth Benz?
I do.
You know that name, Seth Benz?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, I do.
He works for the National Park Service up at Scooting Point, but he's a good friend of mine. And he was quite excited because I think he said that this may be the first recorded meadowlark ever seen in Maine in January. So we're not sure about that, but that's still, you know. So anyway, it was a real surprise to see.
Impressive.
And it was in full breeding plumage. It was a lovely looking bird.
Yes, having Seth make that comment puts it all in even higher standing than it already was.
Yeah.
Because he's a birder of great reputation. So
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, he's been a long time good friend.
Thank you for doing this presentation. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, and Mike and Margie, do let us know if you, you know, in the spring, if you're interested in having us come out and see what's going on. I'd love to.
Yeah, thank you. We would love that because a lot of people, you know, we're always talking about bobolinks and.
Me too.
And
We
I
have-
some habitat
We have a
signs.
neighbor, who is now making wooden bicycles. And he calls the bicycles bobolinks. And he has a picture of the bird and the name bobolink, and that's the name of this. And these bicycles are absolutely exquisite. You won't believe when you see one of these bicycles. It's incredible.
He's still making models. He hasn't sold one yet, but he rides this gorgeous wooden bicycle around.
They might be his first customers. Who knows?
yes,
we
I
have
think
this issue. We have this issue where some people say mow, other people say don't mow. You know, so we've got a lot of people, you know, some of which don't know anything about birds or mowing fields or the importance of fields and all of this kind of thing. So we're trying our best to
That's wonderful. And
ourselves about bobolinks. We were sitting in we have a little arbor outside the house, and we were sitting there. This was what, last spring?
Oh, 2 or 3 years ago.
Yes, and we have a shad bush, not a big shad bush, but we were sitting there in the spring, and all of a sudden, in come 6 bobolinks. They landed in the shad bush. and we're sitting and we were surrounded by these bobolinks. It was unbelievable.
It was like they said,
Cool.
we're home, we're back.
We made it back. So anyway.
That is so cool. So,
Yeah.
and I just put in the chat, as we mentioned, you know, Ag Allies is open statewide, and anybody who was on today who's interested in having a site visit in the spring, just please get in touch with us. Did I put our website on there? It's agallies.org, but
When we share the video and the information about this program for everybody, we'll make sure that the contact information for Maeve and Laura is available so that anybody who views it or might want to connect with you guys can do that.
Okay.
Good.
absolutely.
Okay, good. That's great.
Wow, this has been really wonderful and great fun. And I extend my appreciation to all of our viewers today. It was lovely having you join us, and very much appreciate Laura and Maeve participating and sharing all their knowledge. It was very helpful. So we look forward to doing this in the field in person, hopefully sometime in the summer when folks have time, which is hard in the summer, I understand. So we'll see. And we'll be in touch with our email with all the contact and link information. So
Good. Thank you.
thank
Come and
you.
visit, we'll serve you
guys.
a cup of tea, and you can sit in the easy chair and watch those bobolinks all over the place.
Perfect.
Oh, gosh.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a
Sarah.
good night, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.